Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now it's time for the latest in our series of films looking at how to be a Secretary of State. Now Zoe and Harry will be taking notes in case they one day reach high office. It's one of the newest big jobs in government we're looking at now, energy and climate change. Here's our Giles.
Whitehall, the heart of government. Could you make sure that the lights stay on, the wheels stay warm, and at the same time cut carbon emissions? So, you want to be Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change.
It's the department that I particularly wanted to go to, and department that I stayed in. Even when I was after David Laws's resignation from the Treasury, I was offered the Chief Secretary job and a place in the Quad inevitably, and I said no to that. I wanted to stay with DEC.
There was a discussion about, I think, carbon reporting. And I did point out to somebody that James Murdoch had a more aggressive regulatory position on this issue than the government did. And I said, look, come on a minute, you know, James Murdoch is hardly a sort of revolutionary left-winger here.
I had a lot of arguments with the Tories, particularly on my area. It was, in many ways, it was the area that you saw the most clashes.
Jill Rutter is a former senior civil servant and now at the Institute for Government. She says the department is important, but it's the baby of Whitehall.
DEC's the newest government department, and it was created to resolve a debate that used to go on between government departments. So if you're going to be a successful Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, you need to be able to maintain credibility with the Treasury, who are very interested in energy policy because it's so key to economic performance. You need to be able to deal with big business because we rely on the private sector to provide all that energy infrastructure. But at the same time, you need to keep on board a bunch of very vociferous green stakeholders who are determined to keep the government to the climate change commitments that were set out in the Climate Change Act.
Of course, in the early 80s, there was no DEC, and for both environment secretaries and energy secretaries, climate change just wasn't an issue.
Climate change, in my days as Secretary of State for the Environment, was never the acute issue today, demanding huge subsidies of one sort or another.
Nobody ever mentioned climate change, it wasn't an issue, and it has now moved from not being an issue at all to becoming a mania, so that the climate change tail is wagging the energy dog.
But Chris Huhne, a coalition Liberal Democrat Secretary of State, couldn't disagree more.
If I had to say there was one enormous threat to humanity, not just to this country, it is the fact that we are undergoing a period of enormous climate change, and that is going to have tremendous consequences for future generations unless we get a grip on it very quickly.
It fell to Ed Miliband as the first Secretary of State for DEC to wed these two competing ideas together in a single department, and he knew the scale of the challenge.
I did slightly feel that the people who'd worked in energy felt the people who were from the Environment Department were a bunch of muesli-eating sandal wearers, and the people who'd come from the environment part of the forest thought the energy people were a bunch of petrol-headed sort of technocrats. And so there was definitely a challenge of integration of two parts of Whitehall together. It's not that people weren't committed, but they had their own fiefdoms, they had their own way of doing things, and there was a sort of sense of sort of mutual suspicion in a way.
And Ed Davey was even having those issues with his coalition partners.
I was clashing with Eric Pickles, I was clashing with Owen Paterson, I was clashing with George Osborne, of course. Bizarrely enough, I often got on very well with the Prime Minister because he did actually believe in a lot of the green stuff. My problem was he didn't stand up to the Chancellor enough.
For Ed Miliband, the problem wasn't so much the Chancellor of the time, Alistair Darling, as the Treasury itself.
The Treasury likes to control things. You know, that is their institutional role in Whitehall. And so at an institutional level, there was a sense that, hang on a minute, there's this new kid on the block, the department. They seem to have a lot of control over some quite important things. And so inevitably that produced sort of tension and difficulty, and it was the cross-Whitehall battles that I used to find most frustrating.
Hello, pleased to meet you.
But by the time Chris Huhne arrived 3 years later, the department had begun to find its feet.
The curious thing about the Department of Energy and Climate Change is that it is very much what I call a missionary department, rather like the Department for International Development. It has a very, very clear remit, a very clear aim, and a lot of the people who go and work for it at civil service level, and one would hope also political level, do so precisely because they do share those aims and they really want to make them happen.
Of course, that's all very well if you have the support of key people.
I think the current Prime Minister, actually as leader of the opposition, did help change the debate. I've got to be frank with you. The fact that he took a lead on climate change and green issues definitely held us more to account. But I'm afraid the flip side is true, which is the scepticism of George Osborne, or the apparent scepticism of George Osborne about this issue, him saying we shouldn't be a leader, you know, why should we be ahead of the pack? I think that makes it harder.
You might say, as a Labour politician, Ed Miliband would say that, but George Osborne's coalition partners in the last government agree.
Cameron won't get rid of DEC because he still likes to think he is a green person. I mean, you know, he came to fame for being the first Tory leader to really embrace climate change. But if George Osborne is the leader, I think DEC will go overnight, if I'm honest opinion.
So it would seem that the long view of being Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change is not that clear. Either it will become the department of government, or it's possible that in the future there won't even be one.